Good morning, everyone. My name is Manisha Holm, and this is Lorna Knox, for those of you who don't know us. And it is our pleasure to be with you this morning. This morning's topic about how God knows everything, God has everything. What could we possibly offer back in return? It reminds me of a short period of time in my life when I was dating a very, to me, extremely wealthy man. And he was the head of one of the departments at Stanford Hospital, and he had a research lab where, 100 people worked, and he sat on the boards of all these different companies. So he traveled a lot to be at these meetings at all these different corporations. So it was my brief brush with corporate power and financial wealth. And he invited me along on one of his business trips. And I went. First we went to Washington, D.C., and he only needed to be there for, half a morning to make an appearance at the beginning of this big scientific presentation, series of lectures and papers and scientific findings. And so he told me, I'd like to take you and show you all of the monuments. I had never been to Washington, D.C. This was my first trip there, and he wanted me to see them at night. He said it's the most beautiful time to see them. And so he set me the task of figuring out a way to go see the monuments at night. So I talked with the concierge and found out that there was a tour that evening that would go to 3 or 4 of the monuments. And so when he got out of his meeting, I told him, and he said, we don't want to do that. There'll be so many people. So he ordered a limousine, and the two of us were in this limousine, and we went from monument to monument, and they were gorgeous by night. It was just a beautiful, beautiful introduction to the power and the history and the glory of Washington, D.C. I remember it very fondly. And from Washington, D.C., we went to Geneva. And there again, he had 2 meetings that he had to go to. And I wandered around Geneva and saw the sights. And then from there, we went to Zermatt, which is at the foot of the Matterhorn. So we went hiking in the Alps. And then from there, we went to New York, where he was meeting up a friend of his, someone who he had trained in his research lab and now ran some magnificent lab, at Cornell University or somewhere. I mean, these people were in the stratosphere as far as scientific research went, and I just sort of was tagging along and was having such a wonderful time. And when I got back from that trip, I thought, how am I going to thank him? I was living in a studio apartment, and I had a job, and it was a good job, and I thought I made good money, and I really liked what I did, but I could afford a studio apartment, and what could I give him in return for all that he had showered upon me during this 2-week journey through Europe and the Eastern Seaboard? And so I was talking to a friend of mine about this dilemma, and she said, cook him a homemade meal. She said, people take him out and wine and dine him all the time. Cook him something yourself. Cook him a homemade meal. And so I did. I made him spaghetti, which I do really well, and a good tossed green salad, and a good bottle of wine, and fresh garlic bread, and it was a yummy dinner. And he so appreciated it. He thought it was so thoughtful. And so I was able to give back to him something that he didn't have readily available to him. I brought him into my ordinary life, and I shared my ordinary life with him, and he was very touched by it. He did tease me and ask if he was going to have to take me to Europe again in order to get me to cook for him again. But we didn't date for that long, so there was only the one trip. But it was a nice introduction for me on how we can relate with the divine, because the divine is so immense and does everything and is everywhere. And how do we relate to that? And I believe that the answer is that we do bring the divine into our ordinary lives. We bring the divine along with us while we're washing dishes and taking out the garbage and driving in traffic and feeding the dogs and collecting eggs from the chicken coop. We carry the divine with us and we share that with the divine. When Dambara and I lived in Palo Alto and he was gone during the day and I worked at home, so I was usually home, but we spent our days separate. And then when he would come home, we would sit and talk about our day. And I'd ask him where he went for lunch and what did he order and, you know, who came into the Sangha office and who was doing what and how was that project going. And he asked me about the projects I was working on for my clients. And, you know, I didn't really worry about his nutrition. That wasn't why I asked him where he went for lunch and what he ordered. It was just that we wanted to share some energy at the end of our day apart so that we could be together and just catch up and feel like we had been a part of each other's days through all of those ordinary instances of having lunch and talking with people at the office and working on projects at home. It's a way of connecting. It's a way of being together energetically even when you're not together physically. And that also is another example of how the divine would like us to share our lives with him or her, depending on your mood. Think in contrast of the silent treatment. It's something that I scurry to when Dambara and I have an argument and I am caught up in emotion. I go silent and give myself time to work through my emotions and the conflict and the, what if we tried this? Oh, that sounds awful. Oh, that sounds a little bit better. And I go silent while I work through that. And then I'm finally able to come out of my silence and talk about it a little bit. And then we can move toward a common understanding and we can move forward with our lives. Now, Dambara describes my process as being completely shut off from me. He feels so isolated, so left out, so abandoned. And my silence might last 2 or 3 hours until I've gotten my wits together again. And he feels very alone during that 2 or 3 hours. So I imagine that that's how God feels when we give God the silence treatment and don't take him out to gather eggs out of the chicken coop and don't share our thoughts and our aspirations and have that constant communication with the divine. I think God feels a little bit lonely and just wants to share the joy that we have, the joy that we feel in our hearts, and the love that we feel in our lives. This is what God wants from us, to share those things, the ordinary, everyday dilemmas and joys and victories and everything that we do is what we share with the divine. And the more and more that you can have that connection and share the ordinary with God, the stronger the connection becomes. Asha talks about going to a lecture that was given by a Swami. I don't remember if she was in India or if it was here in the United States, but it was a visiting Swami, and she and a group of friends went to hear this learned man speak, and she could hardly understand her word he said because he was speaking in English, but he had a very strong accent, and she just could not decipher the words. And she realized that it was okay that she couldn't understand the words, because what he was doing, he was just pasting words onto the energy, onto the consciousness that he was sending out around the room. And he just filled that room with joy and bliss. And all she wanted to do was just sit there and bask in his darshan. So it doesn't really matter what what the communication is. It doesn't matter whether or not it's the same language or whether it's the same understanding. What matters is the energy around it, the connection that you have with the divine, the quality of that. The divine has a palpable joy and bliss about it. And the more you can tune into that joy and bliss, the more you're going to feel it in your heart, and the more it's going to guide your days and fill your heart with joy. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the affirmation for today on acceptance, because it's a wonderful tool that we have on the spiritual path to accept things. And it's easy to think, we normally think about acceptance in terms of the negative things that come to us. How can I accept this? And this is the way things are. How am I going to look at this so that it will make sense to me, that I can learn from it, that I can fold it into my experience? How can I accept this negative thing that comes to me? And I'm thinking of my cats, whom I love. They're wonderful animals, and I love cats anyway, and of course my two cats are very special cats because I know them. And we have a lot of very cherished moments together. We've bonded very, very well, and I care about them deeply, and they are so pleased to see me, and they hang out with me, and we have a real good connection. But they're hunters, and we've brought them to this farm where there's a plethora of mice and voles and birds and snakes, and not too many lizards, but lots of mice. And almost daily, my best hunter brings in somebody. And a lot of times that somebody is still alive, and I can capture it and take it back outside to the part of the yard she never goes to, and I can feel relief over that. But oftentimes it's already gone by the time I find it. And that just, it just hurts my heart, because I have a very deep samskar about animal suffering, and the way cats hunt involves suffering on the part of the animal being hunted. So it's a really uncomfortable thought for me, what happens in my house when I'm not there. A house of torture, yes. I used to talk. I used to talk about this with Asha because she was aware of this deep samskar I have over animal suffering, and I was worried that maybe I was a Nazi in a previous life, or some person who loved torturing, and it just haunted me that was in my past, because things that appall you now, they appall you because you've done them and have worked through that karma and no longer want to do that. But at one time it was a big part of whatever incarnation you were in, and so it just appalled me that I thought about how I must have been a torturer at some point. Now I think I was a cat. And it all makes sense. That's why I love cats, but oh my God. Anyway, so we think of of accepting things, and I work with it a lot, how to accept this behavior on my cat's part. It's their nature. It's what they do. I am not going to board up their kitty doors and make them stay inside. I want them to have a rich, full life. And I have learned to accept it. And I put up a little wall around me when I take out these dead animals and send them along their way and hope for them a better incarnation next time. And I do the best I can. I think there's another side to acceptance, and it has to do with accepting the good things that come to us. A friend of mine talks about how she's always been a very independent person, and she worked her way through college, and she became a nurse and loved helping people, and had worked out her whole life so that she was not dependent on anybody else. She could pay her own bills. She had this wonderful profession that she loved, and she could always provide for herself, so that she was never trapped in any situation where she was dependent on anybody else. And she worked herself to death. She worked herself to the bone and became increasingly fatigued and had a harder and harder time managing her job and her daily routines. It was just really hard for her. And she was out driving one day, and she was going someplace where she didn't know where she was, so she was using Siri on her iPhone. And her iPhone lost communication, or it got confused. Anyway, Siri took her someplace that was not where she needed to be. And no matter what she asked Siri to do, Siri could not find her way out of that particular dead spot. And so my friend said, and my friend, just a little bit more background, my friend had gotten to the point where she was so weary, she wanted help. She didn't want to be on her own anymore. She wanted somebody to be there for her to call and who would come and rescue her. And she said, Siri, where's my husband? And she was single. And Siri said, I don't know who your husband is. In fact, I don't know who you are. and so Siri took her to the contacts and led her and prompted her to identify who she was, and now Siri knew who she was. And so a little while later, she said, Siri, who am I? And Siri said her name, and then Siri said, at least that's who you told me you were. So this was sort of like the transition for my friend, that she began realizing that there's one thing to be very independent and not need help, and be able to say, I can do this, and I can do this, I don't need this, I don't need that. But then there comes a time when you get to the point where you do need help, whether it's because you're ill, or because you're spiritually lost, or because you have questions that you can't puzzle out in your mind, and you need help. And I think that it's hard for us to accept help from other people. One of the wonderful things about our path also are all these little guidelines, and one is to practice when it's easier. So if you practice accepting help earlier, before you get to the point where you're desperate for it. If somebody says, can I help you carry that? Yes, thank you. That was awkward. I'm so glad that you helped me carry those packages. Can I open that door for you? Yes, thank you. Do you need any help with that? Yes. Even if you don't need help with it, yes. Because it connects with the other person. It allows that gift to come to you. Because if you can't accept help from the people around you, the energy around you, how can the divine ever come and give you the help you need, the guidance you need, the creative, intuitive wisdom that you need that will help you move through your days? So practice when it's easier. And when you reach that point where you can accept more things will come to you. My friend is in a really wonderful relationship now, and they're talking about getting married. She's no longer nursing. She has started her own business in a completely different field, but it's still a nurturing field. Her life has changed dramatically because she has started to accept the things that flow to her. Not only the negative stuff, but more importantly, she's accepting the positive things that flow toward her. So practice when it's easier. Practice with your friends. Practice with strangers. Yes, thank you. That is so thoughtful of you. Thank you. I want to close with a reading from Whispers. This is Whispers from Eternity. It was written by Paramahansa Yogananda. These are prayer demands for any situation that you can think of. And this one is, bless me that I may perceive thee through the windows of all activities. Bless me that I may perceive thee through the windows of all joyous activities. Look upon me and cheer me always as I engage in my daily duties. Let my every action, whether waking, sleeping, or dreaming, be sprayed by the fountain of thy presence.